In chapter 484, right at the start of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, the Bleach universe is introduced to its final, most devastating and most terrifying villain yet, the All-Father and progenitor of the Quincy race, Yhwach. Now, despite Yhwach, or for my own sanity, just Yhwach's first official appearance in the story not coming until over 2/3 of the way through, his influence is undeniably felt much earlier than that, manifesting primarily as Ichigo's main power source, and then later on as the burgeoning Quincy threat finally materialises in the form of the final arc itself. And Yhwach has always been a hugely fascinating character to me. I loved him from the moment we saw him. I absolutely love his overbearing and powerful character design. But I also think he's just incredibly important to the Bleach story overall, considering the fact that he is not only the progenitor of the Quincy race, but also the son of the Soul King. His mere existence should have massive ramifications for the lore of Bleach. Despite this, and despite how important a character he is in the history of Bleach, I feel like he is a true enigma. We really don't know much about Yhwach at all, considering his importance in the universe. We don't really know much about where he came from or what he truly wants. It is explained to us eventually that he wants to destroy all three worlds and then create something brand new, a world without the fear of death. But I do feel like there is more to this character than that. So this video is not going to be a proper full-on character analysis, although that will obviously come for Yhwach at some point. But in this video I want to take a quick look at Bleach's final main villain, look at what makes him tick, what makes the character who he is, maybe where he comes from, what he truly wants, and why he is so mysterious. For a character so steeped in the history of Bleach and so many important events revolving around him, I do feel like he is a character we really don't know much about at all. But before we begin, guys, if you haven't hit the subscribe button yet, make sure to do that now, because if you're a Bleach fan, you're in the perfect place for content like this every single week. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up as well if you enjoy it, because it really does help with exposure on YouTube. And also don't forget as well to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all of my videos. Now, Yhwach's introduction into the Bleach universe does kind of come out of nowhere, especially for such a major player in the Bleach storyline, such an important bad guy. His first appearance is in chapter 484, titled The Buckbeard, which is what everyone used to call him way back in the day before we found out his true name. And he is immediately captivating as far as I'm concerned. I love, like I said, his design. I think it's incredibly overwhelming. I think he's clearly designed by Kubo to be a hulking, shadowy character, someone who takes up masses of panel space and is always going to be the center of attention. And I think Yhwach did that very well. He was always, in my opinion, a scene stealer, someone who felt that they had an enormous presence, both artistically and within the story, and that's something that Kubo captures right from the very off with this guy. So I was immediately drawn to him in that regard. I felt, as far as the comparisons with Aizen go, and there will be a few of those, Yhwach was already someone who leapt off the page, whereas Aizen always felt to me like more of a subtle bad guy, at least and apart from at the very end. But Yhwach's already a man of contradictions. He claims to love peace and hate fighting. He doesn't enjoy conflicts, and yet he is the one spurring this millennium blood feud onwards. So there's definitely an interesting notion of contradiction with this character. But I said already that Yhwach is steeped in the history of Bleach, and that's true immediately from the off. We find out that he has this millennia-old relationship with head captain Yamamoto, where Yamamoto failed to kill him a long time ago, and that is now coming back to bite them, essentially. And of course, one of my biggest issues with Yhwach and the final arc in general is that we don't get that all-important 1,000-year flashback, the namesake of the arc we never get to see. And I think we're missing an integral piece to this character. But Yhwach himself is incredibly interesting, and I actually think he does a lot of the heavy lifting in this arc. I think Yhwach does a lot to really help this arc and carry it forwards with a massive momentum that we don't see in previous arcs. And a big part of the reason why the 1,000-Year Blood War arc was so successful earlier on was because of Yhwach, in my opinion, and the way he acted completely differently as a villain to Aizen. I love Aizen, he is my favourite character in the series, but as far as bad guys go, he is quite lethargic. He prefers to sit back and let things play out. I think Yhwach was designed intentionally to be the complete opposite of this. Yhwach is incredibly proactive, leaping into battle. The fact that Yhwach was on the battlefield in the first major fight of this arc I thought was really, really cool. He himself deals the final blow to Yamamoto. Admittedly, he sort of cheaps out by having Royd Lloyd take his place, but regardless, I love seeing Yhwach take on Ichigo from almost the get-go in the final arc. And basically, this is a guy who means business. He gets things done. He is a warlord, after all. Like, 1,000 years ago, he was on his horse conquering the Lichtreich, and now he's back to devastate the Soul Society. And I love that. And I also love the notion of a historical bad guy, a historical enemy coming back from the past to finish what he started. I think that's really good. And again, another reason why I would have loved to have seen the flashback of 1,000 years past, because I love that context being added to a bad guy. But even without it, I think Yhwach is an effective villain. But we see that Yhwach and his Quincy's have already successfully invaded and conquered Waco Mundo, and now they're making a move on Soul Society itself. And the fact that Yhwach and his Sternritters set foot in the Seirete, I think, is such a brazen and bold move that I absolutely love. It really is sticking it to the captain class themselves, basically, by having the Sternritters walk the streets of the Seirete. I think that's an incredibly powerful statement to make, and Yhwach is obviously at the very front of that, wanting to actively trample Soul Society. And I do think that despite the fact we don't get enough on the past and the relationships involved with this character, you do feel his hatred come through. Yhwach's speech to Yamamoto at Yamamoto's deathbed is one of my favourite moments for this character in the entire series, where he basically chastises Yama, saying that you've changed, you've become weaker. The Gotei 13 1,000 years ago was a band of merciless thugs, but at least you were powerful, at least you knew what it meant to have power. Whereas now you've become complacent, you're children in comparison, and I love that because Yhwach does feel like a carryover from a more brutal era, where the Gotei 13 captains were merciless murderers, like the old version of Yamamoto and Yachiru Unohana. They used to rule the roost through strength alone, and you get the idea that they've mellowed out, but Yhwach has stayed the same, and he's, just this monster from a time gone by where power meant everything. And because of that, he is ready to take on the Soul Society. But it's not just that, it's also the advancements that the Vandenreich have seen in comparison to the Gotei 13 as a whole. And I think that Yhwach does bring about this real image of a war machine. He is at the front of the Vandenreich, but the Vandenreich has also got these advances in technology that make them technologically superior to the Soul Society, things like the Bankai stealing medallions, all that sort of thing. But what I'm trying to get at is I love the way this early version of Yhwach pushes the invasion train. He's at the forefront of the fights. He's on the battlefield. I love that. We don't obviously find out much about him at the very early point of the arc, but I think he makes an incredibly strong first impression. And I think most people's first impression of Yhwach was quite good, because he felt very different to Aizen. Kubo seemed to kind of go out of his way to distinguish these two characters, and I think it worked very effectively and was a big part in what made the 1,000 Year Blood War arc so successful. Now, I want to talk briefly about how Yhwach was integrated into the lore of Bleach, because I do feel like this character does kind of come out of nowhere. And for a character who is so important to the series, I think that's a dangerous ground to be on, to basically introduce this god and be like, yeah, this guy's been around this whole time and he's really, really important. But I actually think Kubo does an admirable job of integrating Yhwach into the world of Bleach, making him feel like this deity that has always been there. So basically what happened was, 1,000 years ago, Yamamoto defeated Yhwach in some undisclosed way, and something happened to Yhwach where he was effectively sealed, in kind of accordance with this Quincy song known as the Kaiser Gesang. Probably butchered that pronunciation, but basically it's a Quincy legend that details this sealed Quincy king who would regain I don't remember exactly, but it's like his body in 900 years, his mind in the next 90, and then his powers in the next 9, or something like that. Basically saying that Yhwach would reawaken after 1,000 years and answer the prayers of the Quincy. and presumably bring back this Quincy nation that I at least have always believed was probably there before the Soul Society. You know, the Schattenbereich had to have come from somewhere, right? But I think that the idea of Yhwach works really well, and I actually liked the twist that he was the one responsible for Masaki's death. He's this character who is so powerful that life and death don't really mean anything to him in that sense. He's just happy to draw the powers out of every Quincy. And also, I want to tie this into this twisted idea of fatherhood, which is also integral to the character, and something else that I really, really loved. I love the idea that he considers himself the Quincy's father. He calls them my children. He calls Uryu my son, Hashwolf my first son, but he doesn't care about any of them, really. He thinks that they should all act like comrades, they should all be willing to die for each other, but Yhwach himself just sees them as disposable, which I really did like. I thought that was cool. It's typical for the villain to see his subordinates as disposable, but I like this twisted idea that he considers himself their father, at least not necessarily in a literal sense, but almost like a religious way. Now, one thing I did want to bring up as well is during his fight with Ichibei mentions something along the lines of Yhwach always having been a troublesome brat, like he's the same troublemaking brat he's always been. And knowing what we know about Yhwach, the fact that he's the son of the Soul King, you know, can we assume that Yhwach maybe grew up around the Royal Guard or around the Royal Palace or something like that? Again, something I'd absolutely love to have seen before he decided to, maybe abandon his father and start conquering the human world, which is where we see him in the flashback much later on. But one of my absolute favourite interactions, we know for a fact that names are very important in Bleach. Ichibei has told us as much, and we know that names are important anyway. Zanpakutos are called out by their names. And we know that Yhwach's name is effectively made up. I assume he was nameless when he kind of came into the world. And we discover that he basically heard a bunch of humans worshipping God. And I like that Yhwach took the name that he heard them chanting and made it his own. It is like a sort of bastardization of that idea of God. But I think it's actually really clever. And yes, it leads to a slightly difficult to pronounce name, but I think it's really original. And it says a lot about the character as well, that he just kind of took this name that people were worshipping and made it his own. But one of my favourite interactions regarding Yhwach is when Ichibei says something like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's something like, it's not like the name Yhwach ever meant anything anyway. And, you know, coming from the guy who has named everything, that's quite an important statement. Ichibei's basically saying, like, you called yourself that, but it doesn't mean anything. You know, no one gave you that name, you gave it yourself. But Yhwach has taken it to mean he's the one who takes everything, you know, and he says to Ichibei, I am Yhwach, the one who will rob you of everything. And I think that's just really cool. I think that's a really, really cool notion that Ichibei is kind of like almost snobbish about how Yhwach has acted in the past and the way he has kind of chosen to name himself, and Ichibei's like, doesn't mean anything, you know, and that name means nothing, you gave it to yourself, and then he kind of pays the price for that hubris. As for what Yhwach actually wants, I personally always found the motivation to be really flimsy. This idea that he wants to destroy all three worlds to create a world where there's no fear of death. It is a motivation that is literally given to us in the final chapter. It's mentioned a few times prior that Yhwach does want to destroy all three worlds. Askin, for instance, mentions that he is only following Yhwach because he wants to see what Yhwach will create. But this idea of a world without the fear of death, I never really got it. I thought it was really weird. You know, the fear of death is integral to the way Yhwach runs his military organisation, so the fact that he wants to build a world without it felt a bit out of character to me. I wondered if maybe it had something to do with the fact that it's mentioned that in the chapter God Like You, which is a great chapter about the history of Yhwach, that he kind of exists in this liminal state between life and death, where if he doesn't take souls, because basically he is one of these rare Quincy's who only come around every 200 years or so, who don't necessarily just take power, but they can also give it out. And Yhwach, if he doesn't give power out and bring it back, he will eventually become this almost like blind, mute, deaf state, which I guess is like death for him. And I always kind of, when I read the final chapter of Bleach, that was my immediate thought. It went back to the Godlike You chapter, and I was like, so Yhwach is obviously terrified of that death-like state, so maybe that's what he's trying to get rid of. But it felt a bit flimsy to me. I actually much prefer the idea that he hated what the Shinigami did to his father, and so wants to end his father's, as he calls it in the manga, endless humiliation by killing him. And he only actually turns against the Soul King when Mimihagi tries to attack him. The Soul King clearly having grown some kind of affection for the Shinigami over the years, which Yhwach can't understand. I like that, and actually I think Kubo could have done a lot with that. I would have loved to have had the royal family involved more in the final arc, because, Yhwach becomes the Soul King at the end of the series, basically. And I would have loved for the outward motive of the Quincy's to have been this huge, like, we want to destroy all three worlds to build something brand new. But really, it's more of a personal story for Yhwach, who's trying to essentially avenge his father. Can't For Your Own World does go into some more detail about the very earliest beginnings of the universe of Bleach, including the characters of the Soul King and characters like Ichibei and stuff like that, and the noble houses. Stuff that I would have loved the manga to have done, but regardless... But I think that would work really well, and Yhwach does mention in the manga, I'm here to end your endless humiliation. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of his motivations, and his plan kind of adapts as he goes along. But regardless, I don't think there's any denying that, for me at least, Yhwach is a very effective villain for about the first 2/3 of the Thousand Year Blood War arc. I kind of started liking him less after he became the Soul King. He felt a bit more generic to me then. He wasn't really saying as much. He was just spending his time in his chair. He wasn't being quite as proactive. And I guess you could argue that he has achieved his goal. For the most part, anyway, he's become the Soul King. He's got all this power. He just needs to destroy all the worlds. But yeah, I kind of went off him a bit more towards as the arc kind of came to a close. But he is a very cool character nonetheless. And like I said, he is a total enigma. There's so much about the character that we just don't know. So a lot of the stuff in this video does feel like speculation, but there's a lot to like and a lot to talk about regarding Yhwach, which is why the inevitable actual character analysis will be a lot of fun to do, I think. But yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly, very briefly, about this character. He's a character that a lot of people are fascinated by, unsurprisingly so. I think there's so many layers to Yhwach, and we don't get anywhere near enough time to wholly appreciate this character and everything that he has. But yeah, I just briefly wanted to go over what I liked about him, his overwhelming design, the shadowy nature of his design as well. On a physical level, I think this character is incredibly overpowering and has a massive presence in the manga. But I also like how he's integrated into the lore. I think it's cleverly done. I think the Kaiser-Gasang works well. I like that he's responsible for Masaki's death because it, again, drives those personal stakes. I think Kubo definitely tried to make Yhwach both a personal enemy to Ichigo and a major military enemy to the Soul Society, kind of cover all bases, whereas Aizen, in my opinion, only ever really felt like a Soul Society enemy. Which is not a bad thing at all, but whether you prefer Yhwach or Aizen as a main villain, that's definitely another video. But yeah, really this was just a kind of casual chat about Yhwach, a character that I think there's so much to unpick. It would be difficult to just kind of cram it all into one video, but I just wanted to go briefly over the kind of more, shall we say, less tangible qualities of Yhwach himself, like his motivations and some of his backstory and stuff like that, and where his name came from and everything. I would recommend rereading Godlike You again. I think it's chapter, I want to say, 565. I know it's just before the Rukia and Asnot fight. But, if you're interested in Yhwach, that's a great place to begin, because it is really the only insight we get into the earliest days of his life. And also, when you think about it, those shots of him as a teenager when he looks like Tensa Zangetsu and all that sort of thing, that is probably the single oldest period in Bleach we ever get to see. And it is like for only a matter of panels. But that's got to be 2,000 years at least, I would have thought. So that's kind of fascinating. That is really interesting. But But yeah, that's pretty much it for my video on Yhwach. It's a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to sit down conversation about this character. I think is fascinating, and there's so much more to talk about as well, but I just briefly wanted to kind of go over who is Yhwach. You know, who is this guy? He's the progenitor of the Quincy's. He's the one who started it all, but he is also the son of the Soul King. I think there's a lot to go over there. Alright guys, but I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, if you haven't subscribed already, make sure to hit that button now. But until next time, I shall catch you later. See you then.